Kia ora, welcome to Shared Lunch, brought to you by Sharesies with Business Desk. I'm Frances Cook, I'm the investments editor at Business Desk, and we have a great Business Desk special for listeners and viewers. You can find out about it at the end of this episode. But before we get started, here's some very important information. Investing involves risk. You might lose the money you start with. We recommend talking to a licensed financial advisor. We also recommend reading product disclosure documents before deciding to invest. Everything you're about to see and hear is current at the time of recording. Today we're joined by Brad Olsen, CEO of Infometrics. Welcome, Brad. Lovely to see you.
It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. We've got some really big things happening with the economy at the moment, so I'm hoping that you can walk us through it all. I mean, I think the big thing is the last decade or so, right? We've seen really low interest rates that for a long time there, they just kept getting lower. Now we've seen a reversal of trend. They've been going up recently. What do you make of all of this? Are we seeing signs of longer term change in what we're used to?
Well, I think certainly, look, if you go back in history for the last decade or so after the global financial crisis, particularly, interest rates were, like you say, really only moving in one direction. They were getting lower and lower over time. And because of that, you've had an entire generation now of people that not only haven't really been facing particularly high interest rates, but also just from a psychological point of view, you could always just assume that your mortgage would probably get cheaper next year. You know, your savings rate wouldn't be quite as good. Those interest rates were always trending down. You got through to the COVID period. We started with what we thought were low interest rates. We went to basically absolute rock bottom. Here in New Zealand, of course, you know, the official cash rate went to 0.25%. In a number of other countries, it effectively went to zero, if not below in a number of areas. It's still below 0% in Japan. And since then, you've started to see not only an increase to sort of what was more normal pre-pandemic levels, but actually you've seen it boost even higher. That's important not only because it suggests that there is a shift in those interest rate settings more generally, but also because we haven't been in that environment where interest rates have been on the rise. And it's a big shift. I mean, I think of mortgage rates. That's often how I think people conceive interest rates. If you were on a one-year fixed mortgage rate before the pandemic, for example, each and every year you were generally looking at that mortgage rate and going, oh yeah, it'll fall. I may as well fix it for another year because next year I'll come to refix it and it will have fallen again. Now you've got people that are going, wow, how much higher is it going to go? How much stability do I want to lock in? You know, where does it all end? So I think not only from just the level of the interest rates that have gone up, but just from a psychological perspective, people are going, what is going on? Where does it end? How much am I paying? But increasingly also, how much am I getting? Because in years gone past, again, that decade, almost sort of a golden decade between the GFC and COVID-19, a lot of people weren't saving as much. You weren't making much when it came to those savings rates, but you were making a lot more when it came to investments. Now your savings rate is a lot more attractive, and it means that there is, I think, more of a way up going on, people wanting to protect themselves, but also thinking both short and long term.
Well, exactly. And you've kind of touched on it there. It's a really good point you make that we see it often, the big thing that we refer to as mortgage rates, because that's an immediate hit, and fair enough to mortgage holders often squeal the loudest because it's painful when you come to refix. But not everyone is a homeowner, yet everyone is impacted by interest rates. Interest rates touch everything in the world of money. They have huge knock-on impacts, don't they? So what are some of the knock-on impacts that we might see, and why do they happen?
Well, I think certainly the first point there is for savers, and often that's, you know, people who might well be renting, often for younger people as well. They haven't got a house yet, but remember they want a mortgage deposit at some point someday. They're thinking about, you know, getting involved in the world of money more. They're thinking about their investments. I think a bit of a story from COVID. My grandmother called me a few months into the pandemic and said, you know, for older people, they're needing to fund their retirement. She had a lot of her money, in term deposits, and she said, Brad, what's happened to interest rates? I'm not making nearly as much money as I used to. Where's it all gone? And because you saw that fall in mortgage rates, you also saw that fall in savings rates. I think of, even myself, you have a little bit of money that you always want to squirrel away for a rainy day. You'd like that money to make a little bit of a return. It might not be as gung-ho, if you will, as the stock market has been in recent times, but you always sort of want a bit of a return. Compounding interest, for example, a big part of that. But I looked through the pandemic and, a savings rate, if you had a bank account at a major bank, you were getting sort of 0.25% if you were lucky on just the cash that you held in a normal general old savings account. You might have got a little bit more bonus interest if you had it in one that you couldn't touch, but realistically you weren't getting a lot. Those term deposit rates as well, not coming through, and so people were often looking at their savings and going, well, I'm not getting a lot out of this. Maybe I'll take a few more risks. Maybe I'll look at some of those wider sort of investments. And so increasingly, you saw that bit of a shift. And when it came to then the other areas, of course, the change in interest rates, the fact that they were low during the pandemic but have now gone high, changes business investments as well. If you're a big company and you're thinking about, well, what do I do when it comes to investing in a new bit of equipment when interest rates are low, then yeah, I'm pretty keen to buy that new digger or whatever it might be. If I'm a construction business, I can afford that repayment a lot more. When those interest rates rise, maybe I can't afford quite as much equipment. And then more broadly, what we often see is that as those interest rates change in the economy, it shapes people's spending so much that it influences company outcomes. So if I'm thinking about, a big tech company, for example, for people to buy my laptops or my phones or my gaming console or whatever, they've got to have a bit of spare cash lying around. Now, if interest rates have gone up, if they're paying more for their mortgage, if they're saving more money because those savings rates are better, there's not as much money left over at the end of the day for those electronics, so maybe my business won't be going as well. You often see those interest rates and where the stock market very much trend together.
Yes, exactly. And I think it's one of those things that people often forget is it might not be automatically hitting something like your shares investments, but there's usually only a certain amount of money that people have to do something with, whether it's buying, saving, investing. There's a certain pot of money and people are making decisions. And when interest rates changes, it changes the calculation that people make. And you can see things like shares fall in value because people are more interested in putting their money into bonds, term deposits, whatever. It's really interesting how you see these knock-on impacts as people weigh up these decisions. And of course, that's one of the big reasons, right, why we see the Reserve Bank, their big tool is messing with interest rates, because that has such a big impact on the rest of the economy. Which, speaking of, we're getting so many predictions that a recession is coming. Some saying that we maybe are already in one, but it's not actually official. So what do you make of all the recession talk? Where do you think we're at currently?
Look, I think when the official numbers are published, we probably will be in a recession. But I think we've got to keep in mind this recession will and already does feel quite different from the other ones. You look at something like the GFC, and during that period, what you had was people had lost their jobs. They didn't have nearly as much money to spend. There were lots of goods on shelves, for example. You had a demand issue there, not a supply issue. You come through to COVID-19 and the recession that we had during that period, and during that part of time, you had a supply issue. There wasn't as many things being created. You couldn't go out to the shops. People had cash, but they couldn't spend it anywhere. You come through to now, we've got employment at its highest level on record. The unemployment rate is near its lowest on record, but all of a sudden we're being told about a recession. And I think what that highlights is that really once you're at the top of Mount Everest, anything off the other side is going to feel recessionary. And I think that's certainly the mindset I hear when I talk to businesses, when I talk to households across the country. If your reference point was the end of 2021 or throughout most parts of 2022, when the economy was going gangbusters in many respects, then yeah, now feels recessionary because economic activity is lower. That's not to say that the economy is completely cooked and has shut down. It's just simmering a little bit less, if you will, and it's sort of turned down that temperature just a touch. And when you look through some of the indicators, what I think is quite interesting is that When we look at sales and spending, for example, people are still doing a lot of that. But increasingly, because of how high inflation is, that bang for buck isn't nearly as strong. Of course, we've all seen the latest inflation numbers, 6.7% on an annual basis, better than what it was before, still not good in a sense. And we've run some numbers to try and make that 6.7% a bit more real for people. On average, we expect that the average Kiwi household over the last year is spending $1,000 a year more on the same basket of food that they bought. So going to the grocery market, the supermarket, and getting your groceries is about $1,000 more expensive. Same with rent, an extra $1,000 there. So you look at just those two sort of payments, that's $2,000 a year more that you're spending to get the exact same amount of stuff. That means that unless you've magically got a pay rise of $2,000 that you're more than happy to put on that, something else has got to give. You can't spend quite as much on other areas. The other area we're starting to see it come through is on employment. A lot of people are still looking for workers. No one's cutting workers yet in many respects. But what you're starting to see is businesses going, well, if sales are about to be a bit softer, maybe this idea that I need to up my workforce to try and cope with more and more spending isn't quite true. So maybe I won't cut staff, but I might not hire as many more as I first thought. Those are some of the numbers. And the last sort of set of figures I'll leave you with on that particular question, Francis, is the fact that when we look at the numbers of the GDP figures at the end of the year, we saw economic activity contract 0.6%. That's the start of what you'd need for a recession. You need 2 quarters in a row of negative growth. Remember, though, that the economy expanded 1.7% in September. So the economy at the end of 2022 was still a whole percentage point larger than mid-year. That's not to say that the economy is completely burnt. It's just saying that we went up real high. We were sort of like Icarus, and now our wings have been burnt up a touch. Now we've got to take it down a notch.
There's so much happening there, isn't it? And I do feel like there are a lot of people with their heads spinning because the situation changed so quickly. And when we're talking about, some of the things you said there that are costing more, rent or mortgage, if someone's lucky enough to be a homeowner, they may or may not be feeling lucky at this point, but, mortgages are up, obviously. And then food. These are costs that people can't really avoid. So it's very much some chickens coming home to roost. But as you say, hopefully jobs stay safe. And then the jobs issue is a really big one for recessions, right? It's when you start losing jobs that things really start to bite. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, look, it's the sort of thing at the moment, you look at the average household in the last year or two that have got a mortgage, they're now having to find on average $13,000 more to pay that mortgage this year compared to last. And in some parts of the country, it's even more. I know someone who's got to find $30,000 more. That's not $30,000 for the mortgage, that's $30,000 additional this year. So you think about those sort of numbers and go, for that household, there's a bunch of stuff they can't buy anymore. However, and here's the important bit with employment, is that if you've got a job, you can at least figure out, maybe I can ask for a pay rise, maybe I can move around my expenses a bit more. It's so much easier to adjust your household budget if you've got an income. If you don't have an income, if you're reliant on a benefit, for example, you haven't got nearly as much wriggle room. And I think that's probably the important bit. You're right that we do have high levels of employment. In my mind, that does help us through a lot more. If you have to slow down an economy, I'd much rather slow it down from 100 k's an hour down to 80 than to be starting at 30 and to slow it down to 10. And I think that's where we find ourselves in. Let's remember as well, the current unemployment rate, 3.4%. Before the pandemic, we were super excited to get to an unemployment rate of 4. So we've got to get back to 4 before we're at normal tightness. And then above that, yes, there is a little bit more pressure coming forward. But I think a lot of that will be as more people start to come into the workforce because there's good money available, it's not going to be quite as easy to find those jobs as it was before. And what got me was when we looked at the latest set of labour market figures, you didn't have a huge number of people that were being turfed out of their jobs. You did, however, have a 17% increase in December in the number of people who don't have a job, they don't want a job, but before, if you asked them if they'd take a job, they would have said no. Now they probably would have said yes. And that's interesting. That's not, a whole bunch of people that have lost jobs or have even just been magicked up. up. There were people who were sitting at home doing other things. All of a sudden, they're going, hey, this cost of living thing's costing me a bit more. Maybe I need to get a bit more cash so that my household can make it through and make those difficult balancing decisions. That gives me a bit more confidence that, yes, the labour market's going to come under pressure, but I don't see this to be a big place where businesses are going to cut lots of jobs willy-nilly. If they do that after the last few years when they struggled so much to find them, where are they going to be in another year's time if economic activity bounces back? All of a sudden, those businesses have got lots of work to do again, not enough people to do it. So I think they'll be cautious.
Yeah, well, exactly. Fingers crossed on that point. There are certainly some heartwarming elements to this, some elements where we have reason to hope. I think you said something earlier that really touched on an idea that's been going around my head for a while, for the last few months as we've seen the situation change, where you said about, things have only really been moving one way for the last decade or so. And of course, for a lot of people who are investing now and doing great at managing their money, if they're in the younger generation, all of this experience that they've built up has been only in one particular low interest rate environment. And so now heading towards possibly their first big recession, and interest rates moving in a different direction from what they're used to. Do you think this will be a big adjustment, particularly for that younger generation who hasn't gone through this before?
Yeah, I do think there's probably a lot more on people's minds these days in terms of what do I do? What's my strategy with my money? One, moving out of that low interest rate environment for a bit, but also facing that much more challenging period. And I think as well, I remember at the start of COVID-19, for example, there was still a lot of concerns around the financial markets, around what was going to happen with the economy. Were we heading towards Great Depression 2.0? But I think, and I remember, talking to younger friends who were in KiwiSaver, for example, and they were going, should I change? Do I need to move to a more conservative fund? And for lots of them, the answer there should have been no. They made that change without talking to some people and they locked in some of those losses. And you saw the share market bounce back a lot more. I think at the moment, there's also that feeling, though, of look, I want to keep investing. I can still see some opportunities out there. I'm not seeing the returns as much as I might have been excited about before. It used to be that you could look at the stock market day after day and be like, it's a bit more cash that I've just earned on paper, and it's done it again the next day. Now you're looking at the numbers and going, it's not looking as bad as it did the other day, which is exciting. And look, I think that's normal, right, for investing. Well, it should be in a sense. This stuff is long term. None of us have got 3 telephones to our ears, standing on the New York Wall Street Stock Exchange, trying to sort of make trades like that. And if you are, all the best to you. But that's certainly not my strategy. What's interesting, I think. Oh, absolutely. I mean, God, and we've got stressful. The world around us is stressful enough without that sort of stuff. I think, though, what you start to see now is that people go, actually, my own personal circumstances are a bit more challenged. I'm facing that high cost of living. I'm not sure what's around the corner. What happens if something does happen to my job? What happens if something comes through that unsettles my life, my entire sort of financial situation, which is why I think you're starting to see that more of that conversation of, am I sort of financially set at the moment with a bit of a rainy day fund, a bit of a backup plan if things come through. And increasingly as well, we were talking about the Reserve Bank and their blunt tool. Part of that blunt tool is that they keep interest rates low when they're trying to stimulate more activity, because not only does that allow for more spending, but it also says, why should I save as much when interest rates are low? At the moment, though, there is much more of that incentive to save. I can get some more money in there. I can earn a little bit of a sort of a backup nest egg for if things come bad, if I need to, fix the car, or if, look, if I lose my job and I need to figure out things for the next few months before I get a new job or similar, you want to have some of those buffers in place. So I think particularly for younger Kiwis, there is that mindset. Looking at some of the data that comes out from various publications, I was fascinated to see that New Zealanders are saving more now than they were a few years ago. That's encouraging. But you're still seeing, I think it's something like 10-15% of the population who aren't saving a cent at all. And that worries me a lot more, because it does say that, look, there are some people who probably aren't as ready for those more challenging economic times than a lot of others.
Yeah, is there any sort of rules of thumb or anything like that? I mean, obviously this is all general and all of us are special, unique snowflakes. But is there a rule of thumb of how much people should have saved heading into possibly rough, slightly unpredictable times?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people I talk to sort of have a bit of a mindset of having 3 months worth of your expenses is not a bad rule of thumb sometimes. It basically just gives you that buffer of, look, if everything went, completely untoward tomorrow, you've got 3 months to get back on your feet, and you're not immediately going, oh, there's no way to pay the rent. I'm completely going to be turfed out on the street. All my goods have got to be sold. I just can't do anything. So having a little bit of a buffer like that is often a good way of doing it. We often also see people sort of think longer term, maybe some of the conversations, and again, horses for courses, but a third in terms of your money, a third going into your sort of daily, weekly life expenses, a third going into some of your long-term savings, particularly if you want a mortgage or similar. Maybe once you've got through that, some of that might go towards investing, and then a third in the middle, which is sort of more spending money. And people use that in different ways. Sometimes you might use that in terms of, going out to the movies, saving up short-term for a holiday. Maybe that becomes, your investment or some of your investment fund if you've got some left over at the end of the week. People often set that up differently, but often a third is not a bad way to start putting your money together. And I think important, it's good to sort of develop some of those habits, particularly if you do it before the money hits your account, or so you don't have to play with it. I remember, having seeing my paycheck come into my bank account and going, oh, I must remember to transfer this many, this much money to that account for this savings and this much to the other one and similar. Whereas I think in my student loan, it goes out before I even see the money. So it gets paid off, it's set and forget, it's quite nice. And so I know a lot of friends who have, set up automatic payments in their bank accounts that shuffle off money to the short-term savings accounts. They can go over to, I don't know, one of the Pacific Islands with their partners later this year. There might be a bit of money that goes in and it's automatic payment to, make some investments, and others who are putting it into a longer term, maybe it's a term deposit or a serious saver account or something, so that people have got that cash later, not only for a rainy day, but for something wider. So I think a fair number of options there. The first thing in my mind is you always want to have that little bit of a backup, that little bit of a buffer, so that if everything goes wrong, you're not immediately in struggle street.
Yes, totally agree there. I mean, to my mind, savings versus investing have two very different roles in our lives. And big fan of both of them. It's just that they have different strategies, different purposes, different benefits. So again, as a disclaimer, you're not a financial advisor. This is not individual financial advice. But when someone is looking at savings versus investing, where does each have their strength? And at what point in your life are you looking to use either one of them?
Yeah, and I think the point there is that you sort of almost, I expect a lot of people are going to be doing a little bit of everything all the time in different ways. Generally speaking, your savings are often more, in a sense, short term in terms of people. You don't just save up money over the long time so that you get to 92 and you go, oh gosh, wouldn't it be nice to spend this money now? I can't do a lot with it because I'm 92, but let's save it up. So often it's for a savings goal is a good way that you might use that. Again, maybe it's a short-term goal like a holiday, maybe it's a long-term goal like a house deposit. Then your investing is often more of that longer term. Again, unless you're willing to think about being a day trader with your 3 phones up against your ears, you might make some money quickly. You might not, though. And so often that idea is that over the longer term, there is that growth profile, often in investments, not always. And I think, people take their own risks, but they often think about that more into the future. What we also see with those various savings and investments is that it sort of depends on how you want to do it. So let's think through a scenario, if you will, and I'll use myself to a point with a little bit of artistic license. First things first, if I'm starting my money journey today, I'm going first things first. I'm probably going to save up a little bit to start with. I want to make a bit of a buffer. I want to have that 3 months worth of expenses ready to go so that if things go wrong, I've got that buffer. At the same time, any leftover money, I might might well want to start putting into some investments, lower risk or sort of, maybe I'm not going to pick individual stocks. I don't think I'm that good yet because I haven't read up. Maybe I'll pick an index tracker or something like that, which has got a bit more broadness to it. Then I'm sort of going, okay, now I'm, let's say I've got a pay rise, I'm earning a bit more, I've got my buffer behind me, that's good, that sort of stays in one bank account and I don't touch it. Then I'm thinking, okay, what's next in terms of my various strategies? I want to go on an overseas trip with some friends. We're not going to make it a huge, massive trip, but, we want to go away for a week or something to one of the Pacific Islands. We'll wait till a good deal comes through for flights. We'll start putting some money away every week. Maybe it's $50 a week or similar to start putting that together. At the same time, I also want to buy a house one day. And so I might, depending on the options, I'm putting a bit more money maybe into a longer term savings account. When I've got enough money, maybe I'll put that into a term deposit. And then at the same time, I'm still wanting to put that money into my investments as I can, because again, it compounds over time, and time in the market is better than time in the market. With that, and I think this is probably a big thing, it also depends a little bit on when you want to use it. So if I'm wanting that house deposit, but let's be real, I'm thinking, gosh, it's probably not going to be for another 10 years. Maybe I'll be a bit more aggressive on the investment front than purely on the savings front. Still do a bit of both, but maybe I'd sort of switch around how much I put into each one. If I'm looking, though, to buy that house in the next year, then actually I need to have that cash available, which means that if my stock portfolio looks good, great. But if it falls one day, then all of a sudden I haven't got that housing deposit that I thought I would, and the bank's going to go, mate, I'm sorry, but you haven't got enough cash. So often I think over time you're going to see people that as they get close to what they want to use that savings goal for, or what they want to use their money for, they'll consolidate that a little bit more in a much more liquid, much more savings focused, much more cash focused account, so that they've got that ability to save. That's some of the scenarios I think that people often go down. But I don't think it has to be an either or. I think that the best strategy is often a little bit of everything, gives you sort of that immediate buffer, gives you the holiday fund, gives you the house fund, and also gives you that long-term financial investments. All of those are good, if you will, up through the ladder.
Yeah, and I think that was such a good summation, by the way. Thank you so much for that. And I think the thing is as well is sometimes I'll talk to people who get really excited about investing, and I hear you. I love investing. I think it's fantastic. But every now and then I've talked to people who are all in on investing and they don't have things like the savings covered. And I think you should always have both. You need to have the short-term situation covered. You need to know that you're okay in an emergency. That's what a savings account is for. That is not what your investments are for. The investments are great for building your long-term wealth, getting those long-term returns, but they could bounce around and do all sorts of crazy things in the short term. That's exactly how you make money. They have to do that. But that it's going to be unpleasant sometimes in the short term, which means you need both to balance each other out. And considering that interest rates have been lower, savings hasn't felt as interesting or exciting to people. I think some people have maybe had the savings, which is excellent, but they haven't looked into all the various options, because all of the various options have been not much return, doesn't really matter, just chuck it anywhere. Whereas now, when we are seeing these higher interest rates, there is a bit more difference between the various products. So let's talk about the products of the saving world that people might have overlooked until now. Things like there are term deposits, there are on-call accounts, there are cash funds, there are a few others as well. I mean, when we're looking at these things, what are the differences here?
Yeah, well, and look, I can, again, sort of uncomfortably use myself as a bit of a scenario here. I had my savings account through the pandemic just because, again, I wanted that buffer, but I never really thought a lot of it because, look, honestly, during the last few years, a lot of the time, those interest rates were giving you a pittance. They weren't worth a lot. They were basically zero rated. You were lucky to get a few cents in your account every month or two. Now, though, you're starting to get, you look at a 1-year term deposit rate, you're looking at like 5.7%. Some of these numbers, you're talking serious money. And at the same time, remembering those other investments that you might be making, the other places you could put your money, but more of a tenuous link. You look at a housing market, if you were lucky enough to be able to go out and buy a house today, you'd probably lose money. If you were going to go into the stock market right now, again, in a year's time, are you confident that you'd make that big of a return? Maybe not. Maybe over the longer term you're a lot more happy, and I'm certainly in that position. But for a year, I'm going 5.7%. That's not bad. That's actually a pretty good return. Now, you ask about the sort of the different types. There's a few different ones that I'll profile. The first one is your absolute classic savings account. It's a bank account by any other name. You put money into it, and over time they calculate the interest that it's worth, and they'll pay that out. What you also often have is a bit of a variation on your classic savings account, and that's that you might get some bonus interest if you make sure that you put in a bit of money, a certain amount of money every month, and you don't take any out. So you'll always get a base level of interest. It probably won't be a huge amount. Those savings accounts they're not big money spinners. They're sort of your low level. You'll get something for your time, but not a lot. Those bonus ones means that the longer you have that in, or the more that you put in, and the longer you leave it without touching it, you'll get a bit more from it. There's a bit more of an option there. Again, with both of those, you can use your money anytime. Pull it out when you want. If it's with that bonus interest one, you pull the money out, you won't get the bonus interest for that month, but at least you'll still get a little bit of something. You then look at something like a term deposit or a PI fund, for example, and you're putting that money in for a certain period of time, and the interest rate reflects that. And so the banks at the moment might be offering you, say, 5% for a 6-month term deposit, getting closer to that 6% maybe for a 1 year. The issue there, though, or the thing to keep in mind, is that if you put your money into those areas, you can't get it back out. It's not liquid. You can't go and spend it. If something happens in 2 months' time and it's locked away for another 4 months after that, you can't just go to the bank and say, I'd like my cash, please. You can, if you really need to, you can sort of claim hardship and go through all the processes, but you don't get any money at the end of the day more than what you put in. You get none of that interest. It's completely lost. So term deposits are often good for that, bit more of that. I've got more than my rainy day fund. I've got some stuff that I'm thinking longer term. I don't need to use it in the next year or the next 6 months or however long the term is. I'll get a slightly better rate for it. Then you look at like some of those cash funds, for example, and they've got some of those often shorter dated options or various cash derivatives that are put on offer. Sort of similar in a sense. They're often not going to give you as strong of a return over a longer period of time, but because they're a lot more liquid, they're a lot more tradable, people are often offering slightly better terms on them. We've gone dark in here.
Uh-oh.
There we go, we're back. Someone in the banking sector was listening to me as I talked about something that wasn't term deposits. But you've got a lot of those different options that come through. A lot of it as well, I think we're starting to see new options coming out. I mean, Apple's put a new option on. Sharesies themselves have put it up because, and this is very much the thing. A few years back, no one was looking at this stuff. I told you about my grandmother before. She wasn't interested in her term deposits all of a sudden. Now we're having a conversation over how long do you put it in for? Do you do it for 6 months? Will the interest rates have gone up in 6 months and you'll get a better rate after that? Do you lock it in for longer and get that a better rate if there's something competitive? All of a sudden, like 5% is some pretty good interest rate in a sense compared to where we've been in the past. So people are starting to think about that a lot more. Again, a lot for those savings that are able to stick around a bit longer in the account. They don't need to use them as quickly. They don't need to be quite as liquid. If you're happy enough to lock that cash away for a little bit longer, there's a big advantage. There's more money than has been on offer in a long time starting to come through.
Yeah, like you say, we have seen quite a few more organizations jumping into the savings game, as you say, Sharesies included, also Apple with great fanfare launching a high interest savings account. That even prompted a response from ANZ saying it would keep Australian banks on their toes, which is quite a big admission. So do you think we're going to see this as it becomes more of an attractive option, more companies fighting for your savings, or might this be a short-term trend, depending on what happens with interest rates? What do you reckon?
Look, looking out over the next few years, I find it hard to believe that your interest rates are all of a sudden going to calm back down. No one in New Zealand or across the world is going to want to let inflation get out of control again, and so I think you'll see that interest rates will remain at that high level for longer. The other thing I think to keep in mind here is that it's important for the banks, for other lenders and savers, that a lot of the time the reason that they need to see their own savings rates go up is so that they can attract some of that cash in, because if you're a bank or similar, you can only lend out a certain amount that you've got backed up by those deposits, by those savings. So if you're a big bank, if you're anyone else who's putting out some money, you're lending and lending and lending, and there's lots of houses on the books and similar. If you haven't got those deposits coming in, if someone's not saving their money in your bank, you can't keep operating for that much longer. You can't push the boat out more. So there's always that sort of tension over, actually, I need to be able to find that funding as a bank, as an institution. And look, if others are offering better options, if you've got Apple and Sharesies and other people all in that game, then there is a lot more competition for that dollar. Now, if I'm a big retail bank, I'm going, well, if that money goes to other places, then I don't have enough money to keep funding out and loaning on my mortgage book, which means that I need to offer a pretty good rate to make sure that people's money comes to me, my bank, rather than some other investment option or other savings option, because otherwise I'm not able to operate. So there is, I think, a lot more competition coming forward. There's also, I think, there is a lot of money chasing those various opportunities. People are thinking a lot more of, hey, this is worth my while now. Now I need to do my homework, figure out where I'm best to put the money. Do I want that money to be easily accessible to me, or am I happier for it to be locked away for longer? Who am I putting it in with? What do they do? What do I get out of my money? Not only in terms of the interest rate, but maybe, are there social considerations I'm keeping in mind? So there is a lot more, I think, on people's plates when it comes to thinking about savings. And again, that comes after what feels like a very long period of no one really caring much about savings. Certainly the people I talk to, there was always that mindset of, yes, you have some cash in the back pocket for that rainy day, but it wasn't a particularly strong investment strategy. It was get a certain amount and then just leave it. Leave it in an account. You'll never touch it again. If you need it, you can grab it. But apart from that, there were other avenues that people put their cash. No longer. That's very much coming back into focus. And the savings accounts, those savings investment rates, they're very much a stronger part of people's considerations.
And I'm quite glad for that, to be honest. I think it's a good bit of balance coming back in there. If you had to pick one main thing, or even just a key takeaway from today's episode that you think, if people only remember one thing from our conversation today, what would you like for that to be?
One, check how much you've got in your savings and make sure you've got enough for that rainy day. And once you've done that, figure out what it's earning. And if you're not happy with it, if you think there's a bit more that could be done with it, go and shop around. Go and check out, do you want to put it in a term deposit? Do you want to put it in a pie fund? Is there some other sort of account strategy with your bank or with someone else's bank that you could move to that could offer you a better deal? I think there is a lot more competition at the moment. There are some much better rates on offer. That means that if you're not willing to look at things, you are literally leaving money on the table, and that's not good for you. It's good for someone else. Make sure your money's working for you. That's the main message always.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like as this area is heating up, there are so many good deals around. And if you're not shopping around, you're always missing out if you don't shop around, but you're really missing out right now if you don't.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for that, Brad, for joining us, for sharing your insights. And thank you very much to everyone who's tuned in today. Really appreciate everyone taking the time having this good chat. Now, we do also have a special offer for Sharesies investors from Business Desk. If you use the promo code SharedLunch2023, so that's all one word, SharedLunch2023, you'll get $100 off an annual subscription to Business Desk, which is usually $249, including GST. What a bargain. Now, the offer does only apply to new Business Desk subscribers, can only be used once per subscriber, can't be used with any other discounts. Thanks so much for tuning in. Enjoy the rest of your week.